Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for Zooming in today. It's great to have all of you with us. I am Ruth Katz, Executive Director of the Aspen Institute's Health, Medicine, and Society program. We're really very excited to be partnering with our sister program, the Aspen High Seas Initiative, in presenting today's special event, Blue Mind, the Stress-Relieving Power of Water. Now, just a little bit about HMS. The Health, Medicine, and Society program brings together influential groups of thought leaders, decision makers, and the informed public to consider health challenges facing the United States in the 21st century and to identify practical solutions for addressing them. We are also the co-producer of Aspen Ideas Health, the three-day opening session of the world-renowned Aspen Ideas Festival held annually in June on our campus in Aspen, Colorado. Many of the challenges our program takes on are front and center during Aspen Ideas Health. But our program doesn't think of health only in terms of access to health insurance or combating the COVID pandemic or finding the cure for cancer, all critically important issues, no doubt. But we also see the state of well-being in all its various forms as fundamental to good health. So teaming up with our High Seas colleagues to discuss how to achieve this state of well-being through the power of water is absolutely consistent with our mission. We couldn't have a better lineup to have this conversation with all of you. To introduce our panel of experts, as well as the High Seas Initiative, I am pleased to bring in Mike Conathan, my colleague, partner, and friend at the Aspen Institute. Mike?
Great, thanks, Ruth. Thanks to you. Thanks to our panelists, of course, and thanks to everyone who's chosen to join us for another in what is surely a long line of seemingly endless Zoom meetings for a lot of us. So we really appreciate you taking some time to join us today to talk about this topic. As Ruth said, I'm the Executive Director of the Aspen High Seas Initiative. We are one of the newest programs at the Aspen Institute, and our mission really focuses on protection and sustainability of the global ocean. And as Jacques Cousteau once said, and his granddaughter Celine quoted in the introduction to one of our panelists' books, the inspiration for this topic today, Blue Mind, Celine quoted her grandfather saying that people protect what they love. And I would amend that and take that a step further and say that people love what makes them feel good and brings them peace. And one of the reasons why I got into the ocean field in the first place was because ocean and water is one of those things. And it does that for me. And I think it does that for a lot of us. And what we'll find out today in the conversations with our experts is that this is not just a theory. It's not just you who feels great when you get in the shower or you get in the pool or you spend some time around the water, but it's a universal thing. And so we're going to take some time to explore the science behind that, particularly in a time like this where we're facing so much stress as a country and as a world, both in terms of the pandemic. And Ruth, again, thank you for taking the time out of what I know is an incredibly busy schedule for you to address this topic here today, but also issues of social justice and racial inequity and other things that are flaring up around the country and causing additional stress and angst for large portions of our population. And so we want to talk about how water can help in that circumstance and ultimately how that can lead to greater protection for the ocean as well. So I want to introduce briefly our panelists. We will have Wallace J. Nichols, the author of Blue Mind. We also have Dr. Nooshin Razani, who's a professor and pediatrician at the University of California, San Francisco Benioff Medical Center, where she, in her practice, uses nature as a prescription for many of her patients to help them deal with their stress and anxiety. And we have Dr. Matt White, a psychologist at the University of Exeter Medical School in the United Kingdom, who also works with the natural environment and human health and doing research at the interface of those topics. And our plan today is really to have a very informal conversation. We're not even going to have a moderator for much of it. We really want these three experts to just have a chance to talk amongst themselves in a really open format. And let them go and talk a little bit about why they got into this field and what it means to them. And then at the end, I say we'll go about halfway through. We'll be about a 45-minute presentation today. We'll let them talk for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to get to questions from the audience. One thing that's really vital to those of you who are not familiar with Aspen programs, a real key component is audience engagement in everything we do. And that's a little trickier, obviously, in the Zoom universe than it is sometimes at in-person events. But I will come back after about 20 minutes of conversation among these three and start to work through some of the questions that hopefully you will be submitting And the way you do that is at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a Q&A option. If you hover your mouse over that, you can open a dialog box and submit your questions. So please start submitting those immediately. I'll be looking through them as this conversation goes on, and I'll get to some of those with our panelists in the second half of our program. So I'm going to kick it off now. I'm going to pass it to our panelists and really let them dig into this incredibly fascinating topic to me, and obviously to all of you who've chosen to spend part of your day with us. And really just to start things off, I'd like to open up with Jay and just ask a really simple question, which I'm sure you've answered 1,000 times over the course of the last few years since your book came out, and prior to that, which is simply, love to hear from each of our panelists, what does Blue Mind mean to you? What is it? What does it mean? Why do you study it? Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, well, thanks, Mike, and thanks, Ruth, for bringing us all together. And I will say, in surfer speak, I think we're all stoked to be here, getting our Blue Minds on together. So, this phrase "Blue Mind," to me, simply it's a phrase that refers to a universal feeling, as you mentioned. This is not a new idea, but it's a set of feelings and responses to the waters around us that really didn't have a name that made it easy to talk about. And so that's really at its most basic what Blue Mind is just a name for something that needed a name. And I'm gonna invite one of my fellow panelists, Dr. Matt White, to just add to that basic foundational understanding. What is a Blue Mind? So Matt, what would you add to that?
I guess, hi, I'm over in England, in the UK. I'm from a small island actually called the Isle of Wight originally, and I grew up on the coast and the beach. And when I left to go to university, I got very homesick, seasick, you might say, in the sense of missing the ocean. And I've pursued research into what was that all about, and looking at people's connection, particularly to the ocean, but the more I've learned also to other water spaces like rivers, lakes, and as Jay often says, even to the water that comes out the tap. So my research especially looks at mental health issues. I'm a psychologist by training in relation to the water environments.
Right. So if somebody said in a sentence, what is Blue Mind? If you're, your elevator, you've got one more floor, they're about to get off, you've got...
Yeah, for me, and we use whole national samples, for example, the census, the entire UK population. For me, what we find is that people who have better access to water environments have better mental health. So, that to me is Blue Mind.
Right. Nooshin, you've got a perspective on this conversation that comes from both the research side, but also the practice of health. And you said in earlier meetings, I'm not a water person. I think I convinced you that in fact you are. So I'm going to really put you on the spot and ask you, what does Blue Mind mean? What does that phrase mean to you at this point?
First of all, thank you for having me. And second of all, I absolutely am a water person, totally. But the Blue Mind to me is really a mind that is resilient, which can go with the flow, keep its balance, and is also connected to self and to community and to nature in general. As you mentioned, I work at a pediatric hospital. And for the past 6 years, I've run a nature prescription program where we take children and their families into nature for healing. And we started that work based on the science that's coming out about toxic stress, which is basically that big adversities experienced, especially during the critical times of brain development in childhood, things like abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, can have a really permanent it can have a big impact on brain development and also on the neuroendocrine axis, on metabolism, on immune function, and ultimately on mortality. Actually, big adverse events, if you have more than 6 of them in childhood, are associated with a 19-year difference or in mortality, or you might die 19 years earlier. The other thing about adversity in childhood is that it's an issue that cuts across race and class. In fact, the initial studies on this topic were done among Caucasian, college-educated, employed people with private health insurance. So that's part of, I think, the background of why we chose to do this. The human condition does involve a lot of stress. And when it's toxic, which means it happens every day, there's no way to get out of it, it can really lead to dysregulation in health. The good news is that the planet and people have some internal mechanisms for healing. And so for me, that's what nature is. I can briefly mention the ways in which we think nature helps our patients, and then as we get into the discussion, we can go into it more. But for us, the main thing is that it helps decrease the amount of stress hormones, just the amount of cortisol. It helps regulate your stress response. The next thing is it helps you make connections, and social relationships are fundamental to health. And they're also really important in recovering from toxic stress. It just takes one relationship with an adult to get a kid through life. And I would argue it can also take one relationship with a healthy space, like an ocean, to get through life. And then there's physical activity, fresh air, and sunshine. So I think this conversation on how to move towards a blue mind is actually a conversation of huge public health consequence, and also of consequence for the future of the planet, which I hope to learn from you guys. That was a long answer, but it takes a while to explain that a nature prescription is actually not optional.
Yeah, that's a good,
Yeah.
really good point. And I know you touched a bit on this idea of toxic stress, and the research prior to this pandemic was very clear that a lot of people were carrying a lot of anxiety and stress and burning out, and then we layer this this pandemic on top. And I know, Matt, you have experience working with anxiety and stress and depression as a clinical psychologist, and looking at how both green and blue spaces can achieve that. But I think this really underlines and makes more clear to more people the importance of both of your research, which may have been harder to explain 4 months ago, and now it's maybe the silver lining is a little easier to explain. But how have you viewed that from the UK perspective, Matt, as far as the intersection of blue health and blue space and the pandemic?
It's quite interesting. In the UK, when the lockdown happened, the government was very, very clear that we were allowed to access green and blue spaces for at least an hour a day. Unlike many of the countries on the continent, France and Spain, we've got colleagues over there. And the government was very explicit, and it drew on the large body of evidence that we and other colleagues have come up with to show that spending time in these places is absolutely crucial for maintaining mental health. And we've been doing a large 21 country study during COVID, looking at mental health, particularly anxiety and depression symptoms, as a function of the rigidity of lockdown and people's access to green and blue spaces. And it's come out exactly as you might think. In those countries where people are confined to their homes or confined to just shopping and urban areas, symptoms of anxiety and depression are higher than in areas where people were allowed to access these environments. So in a sense, the UK government has made many mistakes in terms of its handling of COVID, but one of them wasn't to restrict access to green and blue spaces, I think, because the mental health consequences have been really quite positive on that side of things compared to other countries.
That's kind of a clear experiment in a way. If you're looking at different approaches to this pandemic and different applications of blue and green space, which kind of reminds me.
It's not just visits, it's also views as well. We also took into account the views from people's homes, and there's now 3 or 4 large-scale studies from around the world, particularly with older people, which suggest that having views of blue space is better for their mental health and can also support people with dementia. So it's not just mental health in terms of anxiety and depression. There are other issues of mental health that's positive.
Absolutely, and this idea that there is a continuum from maybe a view out a window or a piece of art to full immersion in a healthy body of water. And there's also a continuum throughout, from childhood through through end of life. And this idea is certainly applicable to all aspects of our health and wellness throughout our lives, and that all sizes of the body of water. But so we've kind of acted like everybody in the world understands our terminology, green space and blue space. So I want to kind of go back to that. Green space has gotten probably the majority of the research, although things are evening out a bit thanks to the work over there with your team, Matt. But green space simply refers to, the parks, nature in general, plants, trees, grass, what most people consider nature when you think of it, and what a lot of people have access to. And I know Nooshin's research has focused primarily on that, at least in the terms of the terminology. And then blue space refers to water of all kinds, really, but lakes, rivers, oceans, creeks. And I would throw in the pools and the tubs and the spas and the fountains, along with that, the urban as well. But what we've learned is when those blue spaces and green spaces, where they connect, that edgy place is where the action is, right? And that's come out in the research, that's come out in the anecdotes. I hear it in many different forms, from the poetry to the music to the science. That idea of that where green meets blue is really kind of where the wellness is happening. And maybe both of you can comment on that really exciting intersection between green space and blue space. Maybe Nooshin, you go, and then we'll go back to Matt.
My experiences of taking people living in urban settings to nature. And so we are often at the interface of water and green space. And I think, the pandemic has exposed some pre-existing inequities, right? And so if we think about the United States, for example, access to water has reflected some of the society-wide inequities. And as an example, the rate of drowning is much higher in African American and Native populations. I have read actually 9 to 10 times higher depending on the age, especially in school-age children. And some of that is a reflection of policies that kept people away from pools and beaches and actually restricted who was allowed to learn how to swim. And so we go to the edges of water holding that history on top of the whole ancestral history that each of us have, where each of our cultures is deeply bound to nature. Or to water specifically. And so what I experienced taking a group of children who really, for them, the battle is just getting out of doors at all. This is pre-pandemic. It's not really an issue of which kind of space they go to, but really how many minutes a day are they allowed to be outdoors in an unstructured way, engaging with nature. And so what I experience when we get to the edge of water is a huge release and a feeling of freedom. And I think being at the edge of water helps us avoid some of those inequities of who knows how to swim, who doesn't know how to swim. And it's just absolutely like thrilling is the word that I would say, especially being at waves with children and families. And people do have strong emotional connections and memories that they often bring up.
Yeah, you shared some amazing stories from your experiences with kids and families and around water.
Yeah, I can tell you a few of them. I mean, I always try to navigate telling my stories without making my patients feel bad. But I will tell you one. I have a patient who has a limb shortening condition where he has no limbs. And when we go to the bay as part of our program, and he has an amazing mother because he said, I want to swim in the water. And she let him out and he went in the water It was his first time ever swimming. And I mean, he couldn't swim, but with the support of everyone, he was able to immerse in the water and really enjoy that experience. Um, Even though he, has no limbs. I think that was the most special experience I've ever had with a patient. Another one that I shared with you earlier is that I had because I'm from the Middle East, I tend to get a lot of patients that are also from the Middle East. And one of my patients was actually crying, and she was in full hijab, so I could only see her eyes. And when I asked her, why are you crying? She told me that, she spent her entire life camping at the beach in Yemen. And so it was a memory for her. I have other stories of, I had a patient whose family, 20 people in his family had died in a bombing the night before the prescription. And this was a 4-year-old with anxiety. And so, I mean, for him to come to the ocean is really a sense of just being allowed to be a child for a while and to have moments of joy. There's no greater landscape for play than nature, and especially water and sand, which can be very freeing. Those are some of the stories.
Those are great stories, and there's so many. And I have a friend who told me the other day that their teenage son who in the water said it's easier to be a teenager in the water.
Yeah.
And it just stuck with me because I have 2 teenage daughters. And that just, it's hard to be a teenager. It's hard to be a teenager, especially right now, no matter what kind of teenager you are. And just to have ease in your life for a minute is a gift. So Matt, we've discussed this idea of access and equity at length. And I know it's the driving force of not just your work, but your personal commitment. And, every time we talk about Blue Mind, the conversation goes to that topic of how do we make it Blue Mind for all? And the for all means 8 billion people who need it. And that's an audacious ask. But you have some really important insights on why that access for everyone is so critical and such a priority. So let's go there for a minute.
Thanks, Jay. I mean, I'd echo Nooshin's observations, some beautiful examples, but we also both work in a medical context, and the standard of evidence expected of us to be listened to and not being thought of kind of crazy hippies obviously has to be quite high. So we work very hard on standardized, randomized control trials all the way through to the best high quality epidemiology to look at these issues. And generally what we find in the countries where we've got large data sets is that, having access to the coast and to waters is good for mental health, but the benefits are by far and away largest for the poorest communities. In general, rich, wealthy people, most people on this call right now won't get as many benefits because they have access to health, wealth, happiness through other means. It's the poorest in communities that can't travel, who maybe don't have a car, where the quality of their local environments is far more critical for their mental health and physical health. So we see this time and time again through the census data, through the largest, medical records data that we're looking at. So what's particularly important about blue space versus green space is, at least here in the UK, green spaces tend to be used by the middle classes, the wealthier classes. They're the people who go to the big national parks. Blue spaces, beaches, rivers, they're used by all sectors of society. And in fact, some of the poorest men, you'll find them are the largest time in blue space because they're fishing quite often. And they have whole communities, and I'm talking about fishing from the coast now, coast to sea fishing and so on. So what you find is that they're a real great social leveler where people talk to each other. And I'd also echo Nooshin's observation about families and children. We've interviewed kids who clearly say, look, we go to the park, the parents just sit on their phones or read a book. They come to the beach and they play. And of course, if you watch the dads, they're the ones who end up building the sandcastles while the kids are off running around. So they are spaces for families, they're places for the whole society. And we think they can really tackle public health inequalities, which is a major issue in the UK and I believe also in the States.
Yeah, this has been great. I'm going to bring Michael back in to kind of lead us from this conversation into a Q&A because I know we've got some wonderful questions stacking up. But just to summarize where we've been here, so Blue Mind is real. The research backs it up. It's especially important during this time of what we refer to as red mind and gray mind, so anxiety and burnout. This connection between blue and green space is kind of where a lot of the action is, that edgy place, so that intersection. And our priority is equity and access. And really, I would say for me, it's creating common knowledge and universal access. So we want everyone to understand their blue mind, know how to get to it, and then practice that in some regular way, wherever they are in the world. So that's kind of the overview of the conversation so far. But I know Mike's got some really good questions from our very, very talented group of listeners and participants.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Jay, for that. And thanks to everyone for the initial thoughts and conversation. I think there's clearly so much to cover here. On this last topic, it reminded me, I just happened to read this morning a piece from an organization called the Conservation Law Foundation. It's here in Boston. Sorry, my blue mind's falling out of the sky. We've got some thunderstorms here where I am in southern Maine. But Conservation Law Foundation, which is based in Massachusetts, and there was a blog on their website this morning about access to blue space and blue parks in and around the Boston area, and how in the higher income areas of the city, the parks are well manicured and crafted and access is wide open. And in the lower income parts of the city, they're compromised and industrialized and next to, where you store the road salt and the power plants and the facilities over there. And so it's finding this access point, I think, is really critical. And it kind of makes me think, as we talk about this, the concepts are becoming so increasingly clear, particularly in this time of pandemic. But what do you all see as some of the sort of specific goals and actions that need to be taken in order to truly implement this in more of a sort of a directly relevant fashion? How do we implement this across the board? I'll open that up. Anybody wants to jump in?
I'll take the first shot and then pass it around. We think this concept of blue mind, or whatever name you put on it, should be taught K through 12, so that no kid gets through school without understanding the science and practice of blue mind. I mean, we live on a water planet. We all learn the water cycle in third grade. If we could update the way we teach the water cycle to include blue mind, blue health, blue space as a concept, that would probably be a good place to do it, because nobody gets through school without learning the water cycle. Let's create the new improved water cycle and make it common knowledge for all kids. I think that would be massively transformative. And you've got some scalable levers as far as curriculum and some structure to work with. So I would say that would be a kind of a pressure point for creating that common knowledge that we hope to create around the world. I'd love to hear what Nooshin has in mind.
Well, I think when you say it, sometimes it's nice to actually be explicit by what we mean by it, just so that we're all pointing in the same direction. And for me, the end game is that children, communities, and biodiversity are healthy, right? And that water is a public health priority. It takes care of us and we take care of it. And that the therapeutic role of nature is accepted and routine. And ultimately that people really relate to the places that they live, and they feel connected and invested in keeping them safe. So that's a really big it. And I think, we should engage in research, program development, advocacy, and policy that points in that direction. In terms of research, I really agree with what Matt said. I think that, the issue of why nature is good for you is really becoming clear to most people, especially post-pandemic. And so now the research is really in the space where it needs to kind of articulate the more nuanced questions, like, mechanism, dose, intensity, duration. I say that also with the caveat that there's only so much reductive work we want to do, because at the end of the day, like, it doesn't matter if it's water with friends or water. I mean, I think we have to talk about it in the way that we talk about physical activity, where we don't say, well, you have to do Zumba with your leg like this. We just call it physical activity in general. But I do think that there needs to be really rigorous, legitimate research in respected journals, which there are more and more of. And I thank Matt for the work that he's done to bring this forward. But then that work should be done in conjunction with advocacy and policy. I mean, the reason why beaches in California, at least, are very diverse, and I agree, everyone uses the beaches, but that's because there are laws making them public. I mean, and one of the scary things about the pandemic was that it was one of, beach access was limited, which technically, and I don't know if I'll get in trouble for saying that, but I think that's actually illegal, but it happened. And if we allow those laws to go away, then access to water will just replicate all other inequities in our society. So I think those of us who care about this topic have to be really stringent in holding up rules. And then I'll say one more thing, which is something that our whole field needs to come to terms with, is that nature is not a thing. To me, nature is a relationship. It is, especially for those of us who are feeling and have felt the impacts of colonialism, it is a relationship that has a lot of pain in it. And we do have cultural practices that have taught us how to take care of the lands that we were part of. And those have been disrupted for all of us across the planet. And so I think we need to find a way to talk about these things in medical or research terms, but also to remember that at the end of the day, it's not just a space. It is a set of living things that the human being needs to relate with and to connect their culture to. And we have an opportunity now. We're a new global planet. It's a whole planet. We can create a whole new culture of connection. Okay, that was my soapbox.
Lovely. So lovely soapbox.
Okay.
How about you, Matt? Where do you see those big audacious goals looking like?
How the hell do I follow that?
No, what do you mean? I get that from knowing you.
That could definitely be the last word. I'll make maybe 2 points, but I mean, yeah, so eloquent. I'll respond quickly to a point, I think a question raised by Dave Horn about physical activity. So again, I've got very much a research mind. Yes, people who live near a water engage in more physical activity on a day-to-day basis. Childhood obesity rates are lower at the coast. Even in lab studies, if you stick somebody on a bike in front of different videos, they'll cycle longer in blue space than green space and so on. We find what happens is that's a major mechanism for why a number of the health outcomes are better, because people exercise more. It's not all surfers, right? At least here in the UK, it's too cold for that. Most people go for walks or cycle and they just do them longer. And that's why you get the physical health benefits. In terms of the implications, usually politicians are interested in this from my perspective, but only in terms of money. So they want to know what's the health savings. So what we've got to do is convert these things into cost savings for health, and then inform things like the EU Bathing Water Directive, which spends billions of pounds a year making these places safe for us to bathe in or be around. And they want to know that their investments are being paid back in terms of public health goals. So a lot of what we do is turn these things into money, because, at the end of the day, money talks. But fundamentally, I mean, Nooshin also raised the issue of this as being a global issue. For those of you who know about the sustainability goals, SDG 11.7 says there should be fair and equitable access to green spaces for all, but especially for women, children, and people with disabilities. I would love to see that expanded to blue spaces for all the reasons that we've discussed. And once you get these really high-level policy goals, then there becomes pressure at the national level to force those things into being in terms of improving access. So Mike mentioned Boston Harbour. We're actually in discussion with Boston Harbour about how to improve access to all communities, because they get this and they want to market themselves as an international blue space living environment. So I think we need the individual level working with individual families, but we also need to drive at the policymakers so that there's some top-down pressure.
Yeah, that's so important. I think getting the policy piece at the highest levels and then seeing it sort of step down, even right to the townships and municipalities and communities and smaller groupings. Yeah, very good. What we got on deck there, Mike, for questions?
I've got way too many amazing that we're ever going to be able to get through. So I'll just start with this one. With the Aspen High Seas Initiative being a program that really has its roots in ocean protection and conservation, I've seen a few questions come into the chat that deal with this, and I'm going to selfishly pick up on this one first, which is very simply, as we talk about connecting more people with water and increasing access, which are admirable goals, how do we balance that with sort of respecting and conserving these same resources? As you increase access, you also increase potentially risk to the natural systems themselves. So where do we find that balance, and how do we structure things in such a way that we can provide the benefits without putting the resource itself at risk? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I come at this entire conversation from the same sort of perspective as you, Mike, as I'm an ecologist, I'm a sea turtle biologist, ocean conservationist, not a psychologist or a health practitioner or researcher. And so for me, I see this conversation, when it gets slipped into the conservation toolkit, as being an incredible accelerator. The bottom line is we've told a very, very boring story about why we should protect the ocean. I mean, 71% of the planet, half or more of the oxygen, biodiversity, billions of dollars worth of seafood and jobs. And by the time you rattle that off, you've made the ocean boring, which is really hard to do. But that's what we continue to do. We leave out the science of the emotional connection and the importance of that. So first and foremost, I think adding Blue Mind to all the conservation organizations' toolkits will help us build a bigger movement, help us garner more support for conservation, which means more participation, more diversity, more interest from the public health perspective, but also more funding to fix what's broken, and then hopefully to manage the interest in these blue spaces. So each community has a different set of issues with regard to access, safety. On the California coast, beach cleanups after a 4th of July onslaught, and those are all real factors. But managing that while we tell a better news story about the true value of healthy water, which I think we've done a poor job telling the water story. And kind of that's where you began the introduction, was with that. But yeah, pass it around to Nooshin and Matt on that topic.
Since I work at the interface of human health and nature, it's really clear that you cannot deal with place without dealing with people. We did a study of, we looked at a survey that was representative of the whole United States, and we looked at whether the presence of a park helped children with ADHD with their symptoms. And what we found was that the presence of the park was less important than the social structure in that neighborhood. And I think that's something that's been borne out over and over, that the physical spaces are important, but how human beings relate to them is really ultimately what determines our engagement in them. I mean, our work is on human health, but ultimately I think that is going to be shown in conservation efforts. And so I say this with much compassion to the conservation world. I wish we could talk about nature without dealing with the messiness of humanity, but there's no way forward. Like, if we don't deal with racism, we're not going to save the planet. And so the second piece that I wanted to say is that when we really talk about access and conservation, I want to be mindful of who we think we are holding that door open, right? Like, who is the person that's giving access? And you could argue that whoever that's been until now, needs to turn over the reins because the planet is not doing okay. And so it's time to think more broadly about who is taking care of wilderness, or who's allowed to love it and take care of it.
Yeah, those are really powerful considerations, and that reframing is really going to be fundamental to how we move forward with all of these movements that we're talking about: health, equity, conservation, planetary health, human health, figuring out those framing points and making sure that the people who are making the decisions are from a broader cross-section of humanity than the people who have been making the decisions up to now, I think is really a fundamental step. So thank you for raising that. We've only got a couple of minutes left. We're actually at the sort of 45-minute mark right now. So, but the questions are so good. I need to do 2 more, and I want to do them super fast. If you can each give me a couple of words, I'm going to consolidate again a few questions that were in the Q&A. Lots of questions sort of about differences, types of water, differences between green and blue space. Can you each take just kind of a couple of minutes and say, maybe, so Jay, in your world, is there a difference between an ocean versus a bathtub, and how do those, versus a painting, and how do those play out in a blue mind context? And for others, sort of this difference between green and blue, and where the values lie there. Is there a difference? Should we treat them differently?
Well, I know Matt and his team have incredible insights into this subject and have done extensive research on from virtual to wild to even domesticated waters. But my suggestion to people, to individuals, is you tell me, what's your water? And I'll listen. And it may be the kitchen sink. It may be the thunderstorm. It may be the water in your garden. And then let's go there and come up with a plan so that you can practice Blue Mind starting today. Not I'm waiting for my vacation to roll around again and saving up my pennies so that I can get to some tropical location, which is very limiting and not satisfying. I like the idea of finding your Blue Mind locally, in your community, in your place, having that conversation. So it's not a dodge, but I'm pretty ecumenical about water and in its virtual and domesticated and wild and urban forms. But I know Matt's probably itching to kind of add a nice layer of science to this response. So pass the hand.
I mean, I would echo that, and also respond to Kathy Wallach's question, where she's saying she lives on Manhattan and doesn't have access to a car. Where do I get my fix? Well, it's surrounded by water, yeah. And that's amazing. And we've done work in big cities like Hong Kong, and again, it's the amount of time that you spend there. Coming back to the dose response issues, what we find is a couple of hours a week seems to be the threshold. In many societies, including California, actually, if you're spending at least 2 hours a week in one of these aquatic environments, you don't have to be swimming. It doesn't have to be the most, wild place. But in and around water, 2 hours a week would be my sign off, really, for Blue Mind.
To that Manhattan question, so the urban waters, the fountains, the rivers, take the train to Coney Island, go to a float spot, and the West Side YMCA has the most gorgeous pool. If you go early in the morning, you will swim alone. It's gorgeous. Historical pool, not expensive. You can even get your goggles there. So
not anymore now, Jay. You've just you'd be crowded now.
I'm dated. I'm so dated already. But when things come back around, same answer for every city, every town. There's the intention and the desire. But that's our job, is to kind of create that desire, and then people will find ways through the barriers. Yeah.
So Jay, you're kind of answering what was going to be my last question already. So we can just to pick up on this, but one of our participants had asked, she lives in Los Angeles, and with LA and some of the California localities and other places around the country kind of approaching the second wave of lockdown, what's sort of your last words of sort of departure advice, as lockdowns close in again, where should people be going? What should we be prioritizing? You've just referenced some of that, but if there's any more you want to say on that topic.
Yeah, well, you wrote a great piece on the Aspen Institute website about this question. And I think really, at this point, tapping into our virtual waters is important. The art, the poetry, the music about water, the films, whether you make that art or you consume it, art makes awe and wonder portable. Art makes Blue Mind portable when we can't be there. So there's that, the virtual, but there's also the domestic. So I have a lot of diver friends and surfer friends that are just going out into the yard and holding a hose over their head and getting a little dose of Blue Mind, or prioritizing bath time or shower time. So I would challenge everybody on this, listening to this panel, have today or tonight or tomorrow, have the most mindful bath or shower you've ever had in your life. And I'm not going to tell you how to do it. You can figure that out. Pay attention to the water as it hits the back of your neck or as you slip in. Pay attention in a way you've never paid attention to it before. And I know it sounds kind of Californian, and I happen to be in California at the moment, but do it. Just do it. That's kind of the answer. And find your Blue Mind where you can, even with these limitations, I think would be the recommendation.
Great. That's excellent advice. Any final words from Nooshin or Matt on this topic?
I think for the pandemic, it's really important to remember that human beings transmit coronavirus. So the problem is when you are with a human being for more than 10 minutes face to face. And so you can help reduce that transmission by wearing a mask when you go outside and by keeping distance from other people. And I think if you can do that, you are respecting the fact that this virus does, kill a lot of people, and a lot of people who are already disproportionately affected. And so we don't want to be fighting that battle. But that being said, you need your outdoor space. And if you have access to water, you need it. So I don't think that being near water and trying to flatten the curve or stop this pandemic are, opposed to each other. I just think that you need to stop the transmission of, respiratory viruses from your body to another person's body. If you really cannot get outdoors, then I like to remember that in addition to everything that Jay said, we are also nature. And so you can take time to connect to yourself, to look your children and your family members in the eye, and to have authentic relationships that are not mediated by technology. And those things can keep you grounded until, this collective experience is over. Let Matt go.
I would also add that I would agree with all of those things, but we've also been doing research with the BBC, for example, on the people's reactions when they watch Blue Planet. We've been doing research with virtual reality nature. The definition these days is so high. So for people who can't get out, when they're having operations, for example, we've done RCTs in dental surgeries, we're working in care homes. These people also get benefits spending time in the water, diving virtually, walking on the sea, that we do not see when they're walking in virtual parks or urban environments. So we can bottle some of these benefits. The real issue, though, is that if you want to get the real thing, and as we said earlier, we need to protect the real thing for the benefits of every species on the planet as well as ourselves.
Fantastic. Well, once again, I want to thank you all so much for your time and the thought you put into the conversation today. I want to thank everybody who's watching. We've had remarkable retention of our panelists throughout the course of this event. So I was comfortable letting it go a little long because clearly the interest is high. And thank you all for that and for the audience. And so I guess the takeaway here is go soak your head. That's a direct quote from Jay Nichols, I think. And go enjoy your Blue Mind. Thanks very much. Take care.